She had walked the sterile hallways of the hospital for years, the scent of disinfectant clinging to her clothes, the steady rhythm of monitors echoing in her ears, the weight of countless nights pressing on her shoulders. And though she had witnessed both miracles and tragedies, she carried on with the quiet resolve of a nurse who knew her duty was not only to treat the body, but to stand as a witness to the sacred fragility of life. Yet nothing prepared her for the night when the ICU room filled with a light that no fluorescent bulb could ever create. A light that seemed to carry eternity within its glow. A light that would mark her forever. It began like any other shift, the air cold, the machines humming, the patients restless in their fragile battle with mortality. And in room 17 lay an elderly man whose breath rattled softly, whose skin bore the pallor of a journey nearing its end. A man who had lived enough years to gather wrinkles like maps of sorrow and joy, who now lay waiting for the inevitable passage that comes for all. And she had been assigned to his care that night. She remembered how his eyes opened briefly when she entered, pale blue but still shimmering with a trace of gentleness. And he whispered thank you before she even touched his hand, as if he sensed that her presence itself was a comfort. And she felt her chest tighten because those two words were not spoken out of habit, but out of the deepest gratitude of a soul that knew time was slipping away. She checked his vitals, adjusted the tubes, smoothed the sheets, and sat beside him when her rounds were done. For sometimes the best medicine was not in syringes or charts, but in the simple nearness of another human being. And in the silence between them, she could hear the faint murmur of his lips moving as though carrying on a private conversation with someone she could not see. A whisper rising and fading like a tide against the shore. Hours passed slowly, the fluorescent lights outside buzzing faintly, the distant call of codes in other wings reminding her of the fragile line between life and death. And she watched him drift in and out of wakefulness, his breathing shallow, his chest rising like fragile waves on a restless shore. And then, as the clock crept toward midnight, he stirred more strongly than before and opened his eyes wide, not with fear but with clarity. And he whispered words that made the air in the room change. He said Lord into the darkness, his voice thin yet steady. And then he prayed not for healing, not for escape, but for peace, for forgiveness, for the safe passage of his soul into the hands of the one he had trusted since youth. And as those words left his trembling lips, the nurse felt something stir in the air, something unseen yet undeniable, a presence that wrapped the room in warmth, though no heater had been turned on. She blinked, thinking it was exhaustion, thinking perhaps her eyes were playing tricks on her after too many shifts. But the truth unfolded before her in a way that left no room for denial. For from the corner of the ceiling a soft light began to spread, golden and gentle. Not blinding like the sun, but radiant like dawn breaking through clouds after a storm. And it touched the bed, the patient, even her hands as they rested on the guardrail. And it seemed to pulse with life itself. The man's face glowed in that light, his wrinkles smoothed by a peace she had never seen on the dying. And though his body was frail, his eyes shone with wonder, as if he were seeing the very threshold of heaven opening before him. And she could almost hear in the silence the faint echo of a choir, though no music played, as if heaven's gates were already in motion. She wanted to move, to call someone, to confirm what her senses told her, but her body would not shift. Not out of fear, but out of reverence, as though stepping or speaking would break the holiness of what was unfolding. And so she stood frozen, her heart pounding, her breath caught in awe, her very soul leaning forward into the mystery. The patient whispered one last time thank you, and his eyes closed not in struggle, but in rest, his chest rising gently and falling once more before stillness came. Yet instead of the sharp sting of death that she had known in countless rooms, before there was a hush that felt like music, silence that was alive, and the light lingered even after his pulse faded, surrounding the room as though heaven itself had bent low to receive a weary soul. And she felt in her bones that she was standing on holy ground. She wept, not because of loss alone, but because of beauty, because in that moment she understood that death was not an end but a passage, Not darkness, but a doorway bathed in light. And she knew her witness was not meant for her alone, but for others who doubted, who feared, who wondered if God truly came for his children in their final breath. She remembered the years before, when she had seen patients die suddenly, when despair filled the air like smoke, when grief howled louder than any machine. But this was different. This was gentleness. This was love wrapping itself around the frailty of flesh. And she knew without words that she had been given a gift, a glimpse behind the veil that most never see. Long after the light faded, the peace remained, a fragrance of eternity that clung to her spirit. And she walked out of the room different than she had entered, carrying with her the memory of what she had seen, though no medical record would ever hold it, though no report would ever list it. For it was a testimony written not on paper, but in her heart. In the days that followed, she tried to explain it to herself, tried to reason it away as exhaustion, as stress, as imagination under fluorescent glare. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw the glow, heard his prayer, felt the hush that was alive, and she knew no science could erase what had been carved into her memory. When she saw families grieving by other bedsides, she would hold their hands with deeper compassion, remembering the peace that had carried him home. And when her own nights grew heavy with loneliness, she would whisper prayers of her own, knowing someone heard, someone was near, closer than the breath on her lips. Years passed. Seasons turned. New patients filled the rooms. Some recovered and left with joy, some left in silence. And with each passing story she carried that night within her, letting it strengthen her when hope seemed thin. And when colleagues asked how she managed to keep her tenderness alive after so many losses, she only smiled, unwilling to force words on something too sacred. But inside she knew it was because she had seen proof that death was not the end, that beyond the veil was light and welcome. She began to notice more, the small graces in ordinary days, the way sunlight fell on linoleum floors, the way a patient's laughter echoed despite the beeping of machines, the way a whispered prayer could shift an entire atmosphere. And she cherished it all, because she knew eternity was never far. And now, as you listen to her story told through these words, perhaps you too feel the stirring in your heart, the longing for light in your own dark room, the hope that when your final breath comes, it will not be terror but peace, not silence, but a song of welcome, not loneliness, but the presence of the one who promised never to leave or forsake you. And if you have ever wondered whether God still meets his children at the edge of eternity, let this nurse's witness be the answer written in light. For the room that night was not an ICU filled with machines. It was a sanctuary where the veil grew thin, where a prayer unlocked the door to glory. And she, a simple nurse with tired eyes, became a witness to eternity unfolding. And her testimony remains for you who listen now, that you may know hope is not an illusion, that faith is not wasted, that love carries us even into the valley of shadows. If this story has touched your heart, if you feel the warmth of hope rising again, I invite you to share it so that others may know they are not alone, to leave a comment with your thoughts or your own story of faith, and to subscribe to Faith Light Stories so that you never miss a reminder that even in the darkest places, God sends His light.